Hello. We had a week off from these, but Jim was on vacation, but we're back. It's Sunday as I'm filming this. I might not actually get it out until tomorrow, but end tag. Time for the end tag from Jim at Jim's Books Reading and Stuff. Lovely guy, lovely channel. Um, let's do it. The first prompt. N is for New York. What is the last book you read set in New York? The last. I don't know. Off the top of my head. I've read many books set in New York. I lived in New York State for a year. The only place I've ever lived other than Minnesota. While my ex-wife was in graduate school. We lived in Syracuse, New York. But that is far from the city. It's about a 4-hour drive to NYC from Syracuse. People who aren't from New York tend to just say upstate for everything other than New York City. But in the state, the area that Syracuse is in is referred to as Central New York. Buffalo and Rochester are in Western New York. Buffalo, of course, very far to the west, right near the borders of both Pennsylvania and Canada. Niagara Falls is just like a half hour away from Buffalo. Rochester, about an hour east of Buffalo, and then Syracuse, another hour east of Rochester. Anyways, the last book I read that was set in New York, let me look through my read books and find out. So, this one's kind of a little bit of a cheat, but I'm going to go with it anyways, because it is the most recent. But that is The Only Plane in the Sky, which is a nonfiction oral history about the events of September 11th, 2001. Recounting everything that happened on that day from the points of view of many people from all sorts of different lots of life. I have a deep, deep fascination with 9/11, and this is one of the best books on the topic that I've read. Very interesting, very well. I mean, maybe saying well written isn't the right word, but well arranged, well crafted, masterfully pieced together book. And is for 1984. Which novel is closer to our reality? 1984 or Brave New World? I think that Brave New World is probably closer. The idea of the surveillance state of Orwell is certainly true. If you've never seen it, I highly recommend you check out the documentary Citizen 4, which is a documentary about Edward Snowden. That was made basically when Snowden decided to do the leak. He got in contact with mainly two journalists who were Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald. And he left the country, went to Hong Kong, released the leak, and met Poitras and Greenwald in Hong Kong and did a series of interviews with them, which resulted in Glenn Greenwald's book about him, as well as this documentary by Laura Poitras, Citizen 4. Obviously, the book is good. Glenn Greenwald, maybe not my favorite guy in the world, but Citizen 4, very, very, Very good documentary. And one of the scariest movies you'll see. Just the scope and breadth of the NSA's surveillance state in America and outside of America too. All internet traffic that's coming in and out of America is just astounding, terrifying. I have a lot of thoughts about Snowden. I think it's really sad that he kind of has been forced to become this like shill for Russia just to avoid having to go to prison for doing the right thing. But all of that being said, I still think that Brave New World is still closer to where we're at. Just the ideas of like distraction and turning off our brains and not wanting to think about things, and the pacification of the masses through things like social media and the way we engage with content nowadays. It feels more like that than it does the sort of it doesn't feel like a very rigid, dictatorial dystopia like Orwell. It feels much more passive than that. So I'm going to say Brave New World. N is for Nightmare. Has a book ever given you nightmares? The only thing I think I've ever read that gave me a nightmare was I started reading Stephen King when I was 10 years old. Which made my 5th grade teacher very upset. She didn't like that I was reading Stephen King. And my mom had to tell her to fuck off. But I read this short story that I believe was called The Sandman. If I remember correctly. Let me look this up. Apparently, Stephen King wrote an introduction for one of the Sandman graphic novels, and it's all I can fucking find. I don't know. Maybe it's not called Sandman. The point is, it's a short story by Stephen King, and I don't really remember that much about it, but I just remember thinking that there was a closet in my bedroom, and it just was freaking me out, and I thought that there was some monster shit in it. I had a nightmare about something coming out of the closet. Very vague memory, but that's the only thing I can think of. I do read a lot of spooky things, but nothing really ever gets under my skin. Stuff that really scares me is shit like Citizen 4. That's fucking scary, because that's real life. N is for nautical and the Navy. What was the last seafaring book you read? Oh, fucking A. Navy. Yvonne Niage, right? All my Simpsons fans out there. Seafaring book. I mean, the only seafaring book I can even think of is Moby Dick. And I'm not a fucking crazy person, so I have not read Moby Dick. Let me scroll through my read books here and see if I can... I don't even think I've read a book about being on the sea, the maritime life. Huh. Next question. N is for NetGalley. Do you use NetGalley or similar sites? I signed up for NetGalley a few months ago when I started doing BookTube, and what I've found is that they don't really have stuff. I haven't found a ton of stuff that I'm really that interested in reading on it, and it's at this point, they aren't going to give you, if you're just like me, and you're just like a little ass booktuber with 300 subscribers, they're not going to send you a galley. You're going to get an EPUB for your Kindle, and I don't really like reading ebooks that much. I have, and I will, but it doesn't excite me. So I have not read anything from NetGalley yet, but maybe one day I will. Ugh. N is for nonfiction. What percentage of the books you read are nonfiction? I would say a pretty low percent. This year I've read around 40 books. Famously, I think at this point I've been in a pretty bad dry slump for the last 3 months. But I was reading pretty breakneck for a little while there, so I've got 40 under my belt for the year. But the only nonfiction book I've read this year is one that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, which is The Only Plane in the Sky. Usually when I'm interested in a topic, a nonfiction topic, I will do reading about that just on the internet. Wikipedia and primary sources that Wikipedia is citing, and other, articles and writings about them online. It's pretty rare that I actually hunt down a nonfiction book about a topic. Let me scroll through and see what the last nonfiction thing I read before Only Plane in the Sky was, because it's been a while. It was in 2016. I read some books by John Ronson. I read Them, Adventures with Extremists. Absolutely fantastic book. It is a series of vignettes, essays of him hanging out with people with extreme thoughts, extremists. So one chapter features him and a very young Alex Jones, back when Alex Jones was just hosting a radio show in Austin. Him and Alex Jones go and infiltrate Bohemian Grove, the exclusive party in the wilderness of California, where rich people burn a giant wooden owl and get drunk, and people think that it's sort of like a New World Order group. It's not. There's also a section in Them where he goes on he accompanies David Icke on a book tour in Canada, where he's being, I think they might have maybe they didn't even go because Canada wouldn't let him in or something along those lines, because they accused him of anti-Semitism. David Icke, of course, famously was a soccer player in England in the 80s, I believe. And then in the 90s became famous for peddling and conspiracy, writing books about how the Earth is governed by a secret cabal of shape-shifting aliens who take the form of lizard people. Their base of operations is in the moon, which of course is actually a hollow space station, amongst many other things. He was, I don't know if he originated the idea of reptilians, but he's definitely the most famous and popularized the theory. Very weird, interesting guy. Not really anti-Semitic, I don't think. He very vehemently denies being anti-Semitic, and the idea, of course, of him being anti-Semitic comes from the idea that he's using coded language, that he doesn't actually... People have a hard time, I think, believing that he actually thinks that interdimensional lizards are ruling Earth. They think that he's obscuring the fact that he's actually saying that Jews run the Earth. But he's very, very vehemently opposed to that concept, and he is very insistent that it is interdimensional lizards that run the Earth. So, but yeah, that was Them by John Ronson. I read another book by John Ronson earlier that year called So You Have Been Publicly Shamed, which is about people who have basically been canceled. This was written before like cancel culture sort of became a hot button issue, but it's about people who have been publicly shamed, generally through the internet or things like that, and how that has affected their lives. Very interesting read. That was in 2016, though, so it had been 4 years since I read a nonfiction book. In 2015, I read Into Thin Air, the famous book by Jon Krakauer about him climbing Mount Everest. And he happened to be part of an expedition that was struck by a storm and then experienced one of the deadliest days in Everest history, where I believe around 10 people died, including a number of people from Krakauer's expedition, including the man who led Krakauer's expedition, all passed away on the mountain. Fantastic book. Absolutely. I mean, I've always had a very weird interest in Everest, not because I care about mountain climbing, but because the people dying on it is very fascinating, and the culture of that, and just like they have to leave their bodies there. So when you climb Everest, it's just like a graveyard of dead bodies that have been laying there for 30 years, and they use certain bodies as way markers, and it's like you're getting close to the summit when you see this guy with the green boots, because or whatever. It's very weird. Also in 2015, I read Zona, which is a book-length essay by Jeff Dyer about the movie Stalker, which is maybe my favorite movie. The movie that it's my favorite movie. Whatever. Yeah, and when I was in college, I read more nonfiction as well, but mostly because I was assigned it. But I don't read much. Like I said, there was that 4-year gap where I didn't read any nonfiction at all, so not a whole lot. 5%, probably less. And as for 19th century, what is the last book you read that was written in the 19th century? Another thing that I am not famous for reading a lot of is books from the 19th century. I'm sure it had to have been during college. It was the last time I read something from the 19th century. I read stuff from the early 20th century somewhat often, but I have no idea. I have no idea what the last thing I read from the 19th century was, but it's been many years. I don't like it very much, It's just not my thing. And as for Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland's reading affected how she saw the world. Has your reading affected the way you see the world? I think that if you read regularly and it doesn't affect the way you see the world, there's something weird going on there. There's some pieces missing to that puzzle. All art shifts my perspective. I think that maybe books, novels, more than maybe almost any other form of art, allow you to live through other people, to experience life through another person's perspective, which I think grants you great empathy and understanding. And it's one of the best things about books, I think, is the broadening of the horizons, the learning and bettering of the self. Yeah. And as for notes, do you make notes when you're reading? Not since college. I did a lot in college, but that's because you have to write papers and shit, so you want to underline passages and make citations and stuff so that you can find things easily when you need to flip back through the book to pull quotes out and stuff. But in my day-to-day life, I don't mark books anymore. I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. It just, it distracts me and takes me out of the experience. I want to be engrossed, and if I'm being overly critical and analytical, I feel like it takes me out of the story. Maybe that's kind of a soy take, but it's just how I feel. And as for neurodiversity, do the protagonists in your reading have different ways of thinking to what you might be considered normal? Gosh, neurodiversity, as I understand it, being neurodivergent encompasses the autism spectrum, as well as things like ADHD and OCD, but does not include like mental illnesses, like the ones that I suffer from. I do tend to read a lot of books about mental illness and people who have mental illness, because I think that people like to read books that they see themselves in, right? I think that makes sense. But for neurodivergence, probably the most famous novel is going to be The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon, which is about a boy on the autism spectrum, on the more, maybe, I don't know what the right word would be, but severe case of autism. That book is very popular. I'm sure most people, if they haven't read it, at least know of it. It's probably one of the most acclaimed and famous novels of the last 20 years. I read it back when it came out, and it's a fine book. I think it did a lot of good for helping people, for awareness of autism, which is great. But I find that a lot of the books that are about neurodivergence and about characters on the autism spectrum are like targeted at like younger readers, which is good. That's fine. But I usually just don't have an interest in reading like young adult books for the most part. There's a couple of nonfiction books that have come out in the last like 10 years that I've had interest in reading that I haven't actually read, like Look Me in the Eye, or that other book, the book by the Japanese kid, The Reason I Jump. I read a chunk of The Reason I Jump when I worked at Barnes & Noble. It's pretty short, and I liked what I read. And also, of course, the works of Temple Grandin, who is one of the coolest people ever, I think. She's just a lovely person. One of, like, I was a women's studies minor in college, back when before they changed it to just gender studies. Good call on their part to change it to just gender studies. But when you take gender studies or women's studies, you end up learning a lot about women in history who were really important people who have been sort of forgotten, or not forgotten, purposely omitted from history, right? Not to say necessarily that Temple Grandin has suffered that, but just suffice it to say that I have learned about a lot of very cool women throughout history, and I would just say that Temple Grandin is one of my favorites. She's a very, very cool lady, and I have an incredible amount of respect for her. It will be a sad day when she passes away. She's getting old. And as for next, what is the next book you intend to read? Well, I actually went to the bookstore a couple days ago and picked up a couple of new books, hoping to get myself kick-started on reading. And the one I'm going to try first is Vernon Subutext 1 by Virginie Despentes. This is the first book of a trilogy that are just called Vernon Subutext 1, 2, and 3. It's one of those trilogies where it was like it was all written basically at once and then published, one a year, sort of like the Jeff Vandermeer Southern Reach trilogy, where it's intended to be one canonical work, but it's split into 3 volumes, right? So Virginie Despentes, very notorious figure in the world of French counterculture and feminism, sort of a French Gen X French analog to someone like Kathy Acker. She published her first novel, Baisse-moi, in 1993, and then in 2000 that novel was adapted for the screen by her, and she also co-directed the film with a woman whose name I'm not going to be able to remember, who was a pornographic actress and director, and then the movie was made primarily starring pornographic actors and actresses, and featured uncensored, unsimulated sex in it. It's a rape revenge movie. It's always released in America as Baisse-moi because the translation of Baisse-moi is fuck me. So that was how I was sort of familiar with Virginie Despentes. Up until now, I own Baisse-moi on DVD. But this novel is about a guy who was a record shop owner, and, as record shops sort of are dying in the late 2000s, he loses his record shop, and then the rock star friend who he has been bankrolled by and sort of living off of his whole life suddenly dies of a drug overdose, and he finds himself sort of homeless and goes on this quixotic journey of the counterculture and underworld and aging Gen Xers of modern France. All the while he is carrying along with him the final recordings of this rock star friend, and various characters are trying to track him down so they can get their hands on these tapes. So this is like, so many check marks are getting checked here for this being up my alley. So this is what I intend to read next. The other thing I got that I might read next instead is Appleseed by Matt Bell. This just came out like a month ago, but I have been awaiting its release for some time. Matt Bell has been on my radar for many years, but I've never read anything by him. He published this book in 2012 called Cataclysm Baby, which sounded really interesting to me, but the publisher of it, I believe, went out of business really shortly after it was published, and then the book was out of print. And for years and years I would always want to read it, but I would look it up online, and all the copies would be like $40-$50, and it's like 100 pages long, and I just could never justify spending that money. I have looked more recently, and it appears to be back in print. They have new copies on Amazon for like $15, so I might have to pick that up as well. But anyways, I've never read anything by Matt Bell, but this just came out. It's got pull quotes from Karen Russell, Kelly Link, and it's a story about, let me just read this. It's got 3 narratives. I don't know if they intertwine or how it's structured, but the first narrative is in 18th century Ohio, 2 brothers are planting apple orchards from which they plan to profit. As they remake the wilderness in their own image, long-held bonds and secrets between the two will be tested, fractured, and broken, and possibly healed. Then, 50 years from now, so late 21st century, climate change has ravaged the Earth. Having invested early in genetic engineering and food science, one company now owns all of Earth's resources. But a growing resistance is working to redistribute both land and power, and in a pivotal moment for the future of humanity, one of the company's original founders will return, intending to destroy what he built. And then finally, 1,000 years in the future, North America is covered by a massive sheet of ice, inhabited by only one lonely being in a deteriorating tech station. In a daring and quixotic quest, he sets out across the continent in search of a fabled last remnant of civilization. Sounds fucking awesome, personally. I think. Both these books sound awesome. I was very excited to pick them both up. I think I'm going to try reading Vernon Subutex first, but we'll see. So for next, that's what I'm saying. Then Jim's got a bunch of bonus prompts. Let's go through those. Why not? Excuse me. And it's for Nigeria. What is the last book you read in Nigeria, set in Nigeria, or by a Nigerian author? God. You know, I'm fucking shitty white American, so I can never remember what countries people are from. Nigeria. I think Adichie is from Nigeria. She is. So I started Americana, didn't finish it. It's fine. She has since said things that weren't great, so I don't know how badly I want to read her. Just Google Nigerian books. Oh no, I was wrong. Things Fall Apart. Achebe is Nigeria. I was thinking for some reason, I was like, is that Nigeria? No, it's Kenya. But it is about pre-colonial life in Nigeria. Things Fall Apart. That's like one of the all-time classics of post-colonial literature. I read it when I was in high school, and then I read it again in college when I took a course on post-colonial literature. Very, very good book. Very good book. But that was a number of years ago, and I'm looking at Nigerian books here on Google, and I don't see anything else that I've read. Yeah, so that's my answer. Things Fall Apart. And as for North, what do you understand by the North? Well, there's a lot of different ways that this phrase can have context, right? We've got the Great White North, of course, my neighbors to the North, Canada. And the Great White North, of course, always makes me think of Bob and Doug McKenzie, Strange Brew. In America, in the U.S., the North is sort of usually thought of in juxtaposition to the South, and usually that's sort of in context of the Civil War. The North, of course, the Union, the American government, and then the South, the Confederacy seceded from America, and we went to war. And that was when Abraham Lincoln was the president. In the 1860s. The North, though, in America, the designation of the North doesn't really exist in sort of when you think of geographical regions. You've got like New England, you've got the South, also thought of as like the Bible Belt often, the Midwest, which is Minnesota is considered a part of. Midwest, very deceiving name. People will also talk about like the prairie states. Minnesota gets lumped in there sometimes. And then you've got like the Rockies, which is going to be like Colorado, Utah. You've got the Southwest, which is places like Arizona and New Mexico. The Pacific Northwest, which is Oregon and Washington. And then people also just talk about the West Coast, though usually they just mean California when they say that. So the North, when I think of the North, I think of Minnesota. It's the coldest state in the country. It's often the state that is thought of as being most analogous culturally to Canada. But if I want to think about it in a more sort of macro lens, the North can also just mean the Northern Hemisphere, which is a sort of wild way of looking at the world because of the differences between the northern and southern hemispheres. Northern hemisphere, of course, is where the majority of people live on Earth, which composes North America and Europe and the majority of Asia, with South America, Africa, and Australia and Oceania being in the southern hemisphere. And the history of the southern hemisphere is one that is so deeply rooted in colonialism. Colonialism in South America, colonialism in Africa, colonialism in Australia, New Zealand. The northern hemisphere is where the power is, right? So it's an interesting distinction. I've never been to the southern hemisphere. Never crossed the equator. I don't think. I have been to Asia. I've been close to the equator, but I don't think I ever crossed it. I'm pretty sure. No, I didn't. I've been close, but I've never crossed it. And this for Noir. Who is your favorite writer of noir books? I've talked about this before, that I don't really read a ton of mysteries and things like that. I do like noir, but most of my exposure to noir stuff is in film. I have read The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, which is sort of a classic noir text. But I think that's the only one I've read. I have a friend who's gotten really into collecting like pulp noir mysteries from the early 20th century in paperback, which is cool. They're very cool artifacts. They have fantastic cover arts and stuff. Very, very cool thing to collect, but I've never really read anything of it. N is for nasty. Is there a character in a book you found to be nasty? Not out and out evil, but just not nice. God. A lot of the men of the sluts, I think, fit this description. The rule of thumb is not to kink shame, right? But some of the guys in the sluts need to tone it down a bit. Like the person who just is obsessed with the idea of breaking pretty men's legs. He finds it very erotic to think of breaking their legs and then them having to walk on crutches for months. That's pretty nasty. Maybe not evil, but definitely nasty. God, nasty but not evil. It's such a weird distinction. Gross. Who's gross? I don't know. I'll leave it at that. And as for New Zealand, have you read any books from New Zealand? I don't think I've read a book from New Zealand. Eleanor Catton is from New Zealand. And I did buy The Luminaries when it came out, and never read it, and then eventually got rid of it. It's a very large book that I just never felt like I could tackle. I never felt up to the task. I don't think I've ever read a New Zealand book. New Zealand film, of course, is fantastic. Peter Jackson being the sort of de facto man of that country, though I'm more of a fan personally of Taika Waititi, who has made a number of wonderful films, including What We Do in the Shadows, which is one of my favorite comedies of all time, and Jojo Rabbit, and a number of other movies. Thor Ragnarok, probably his most famous movie. N is for novel and novella. What length of book are you most comfortable reading? You know, I don't think I have... I think when I was younger, I felt like long books were better. But I think that is a naive take, personally. Not something isn't necessarily good just because it's long. There's a lot of epic fantasy that is very long and not good. I've talked before about my distaste for that, and things like The Wheel of Time, and how sort of mediocre I found the Song of Ice and Fire books to be when I read them. The ones that I did read, because I stopped after the fourth one, never read the fifth one. I think that a book just needs to justify its own length. Not every story needs to be long. Some stories work better when they're short. I think something like Sleep Donation by Karen Russell, which is a novella that I read earlier this year, worked great at that length, at that novella length. Whereas something that is epic and sprawling that I read this year, like J.R. by William Gaddis, which is a very long, it's like 700 some pages long, and very dense. It doesn't have paragraph breaks or chapter breaks in it, so it's even longer than it seems. But the epic scope and complication of the story and the interactions of the characters, it justifies its length. So I guess the answer isn't really like about how comfortable I am or preferring a shorter or longer book. It's more just like it's up to the author to know what length their story needs to be, right? Yeah. And the final bonus question, N is for nature. Do you have a favorite nature writer or a book about nature? I haven't really read much of anything about nature in my life, I don't think. I don't know. I did profess my love for Temple Grandin a little bit ago, and she writes about animals a lot, which is sort of writing about nature in a way. But I've never read any of the the big classics of nature writing or anything like that, so I don't know. I don't have anything to say on the topic. All right, this video is long as fuck. Again, always, forever. Thanks for watching, everybody. My hair. I'm looking at myself. My hair is it's pushed back. It's not slicked back. All right, I'm not a piece of shit anymore. It used to be. This baby knows. If you understand what I'm talking about, thank you. Good night.